Although not originally a progressive movement, the Black Lives Matter movement fit very neatly in with progressive principles and gained almost universal acceptance with progressives, and is now one of the causes that they champion. On August the 8th, 2015, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders hosted a campaign rally in Seattle where he attempted to give a speech.
Thank you, Seattle, for being one of the most progressive cities in the United States of America.
Barely had these words come out of his mouth when Black Lives Matter activists led by this particular woman climbed onto the stage and interrupted his speech. They demanded that Sanders relinquish his platform so that these activists could speak instead of him, at his rally, during his presidential campaign, or the event would be shut down.
If you do not listen to her, your event will be shut down right now. Right now.
Members of Sanders' team were understandably reluctant to do this, but the Black Lives Matter activists won them over like this.
We're gonna let you on the mic. We're gonna give you the mic.
After commandeering Sanders' platform from him, the activists then go on to declare the crowd are racists.
And we're going to honor the memory of Michael Brown, and we're going to honor all of the Black lives lost this year, and we're going to honor the fact that I have to fight through all these people to say, my life matters! That I have to get up here in front of a bunch of screaming white racists to say my life fucking matters! How dare you!
The plan after commandeering the platform was to do a 4.5 minute moment of silence, or else it was going to get shut down.
We're doing a 4.5 minute moment of silence for Mike Brown as soon as everybody is silent. Speak or we'll shut it down. Get out of my face.
So where did this leave Bernie Sanders? Well, it left him standing on the sidelines of his own rally after it was completely co-opted by these activists for their own political purposes. And in doing so, they completely denied his personal liberty and freedom to speak at his own event. And this isn't even the first time this has happened to Bernie Sanders. The same thing happened in Phoenix in July. And the deep irony of all of this is that Bernie Sanders is a supporter of Black Lives Matter. He has been a civil rights activist since the 60s and has marched with Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, now progressives have to explain to everyone exactly why the Black Lives Matter movement is opposed to Bernie Sanders, the only candidate who actually gives a damn about their cause. Progressive media has absolutely failed to explain why this is happening. Here's Vox's reasoning for you. So after being interrupted in Phoenix, Sanders said, "I've spent 50 years of my life fighting for civil rights. If you don't want me to be here, that's okay." Note the language that Sanders is using. He's talking about himself as an individual. But the progressive explanation for this is entirely collectivist, and so they end up talking past each other. White progressives can often ignore issues that disproportionately affect people of colour. As progressives, they think of themselves as defenders of people of colour and other marginalised groups, so when they're challenged on their anti-racist bona fides by activists of colour, they tend to react with disbelief, defensiveness, or outright hostility. None of this is speaking to the concerns of the individuals within the crowd. Hell, some of them even shouted out what their problems were.
How dare she call me a racist? I won't pen.
How dare she call me a racist? Not how dare black people call white people racists. We are dealing with a liberal in the crowd there. And I think that the problem people had with these people interrupting Bernie Sanders is the same problem I have with it. It denies him his personal liberty to speak, which they had no right to do to Bernie Sanders as an individual, especially not for a remote, abstract principle that has absolutely no bearing on Bernie Sanders himself. Given that the protesters interrupting Bernie Sanders and demanding the use of his platform hadn't earned it, but were instead requisitioning it on the basis of their skin colour, that brings us to the second liberal principle that is under attack: equality of opportunity. Equal opportunity is the stipulation that all people should be treated similarly, unhampered by artificial barriers, prejudices, or preferences, so that important jobs should go to those most qualified, and not go to persons for arbitrary or irrelevant reasons, such as circumstances of birth, upbringing, friendship ties to whoever's in power, religion, sex, ethnicity, race, caste, or involuntary personal attributes such as disability, age, gender, or sexual orientation. Individuals should succeed or fail based on their own efforts and not extraneous circumstances. By simply elucidating what equality of opportunity is, it becomes self-evident as to why the Black Lives Matter protesters commandeering Bernie Sanders' platform is a problem for liberals. They didn't earn it, therefore they do not deserve it, and they certainly do not have the right to deny it to the person who did earn it based on their race. And it's the principle of equality of opportunity that gives liberals such a problem with affirmative action and quotas. There's not really all that much to say about this. The very concept of a quota is in direct opposition to the concept of equality of opportunity. The idea that people shouldn't be judged based on their race or their gender or their sexual orientation or any other arbitrary factors that would make them belong to a group. This is of course because the very nature of quotas is anti-individualistic. It is setting the individual into a demographic category over which they have no control and making a judgment about a person based on that instead of any merits they might have as an individual. The issues with quotas have been long known. Take, for example, this article from 1997, where a professor is complaining that his black and Mexican American students were not academically competitive with white students at the nation's top universities. And yes, I can hear the deep inhalation from the progressives watching this video. But before you feel compelled to open your mouths and start branding people all sorts of labels, why don't we actually look at why he said that? His contention wasn't down to any kind of racial inferiority, but was the result primarily of cultural effects. They have a culture that seems not to encourage achievement. Failure is not looked upon with disgrace. Now, I don't know whether he's right or wrong, but what we do know is that poverty doesn't exactly aid an academic career, and that once Texas universities were banned from using race as a factor in admissions, minority enrollment at the school dropped sharply, with 4 black and 26 Mexican American students from the first year law school class of 468 students, down from 31 black and 42 Mexican American students the previous year. Now, this is a really thorny issue to discuss, and I know that people on all sides of this issue are probably having the knee-jerk reaction to start trying to slap labels on people for even discussing it. But let's be clear. We are only talking about the handful of individuals who were given the benefit of affirmative action when, in reality, their grades did not warrant them having these university positions. They are not representative of their race, they are not representative of their gender or class, they are only representative of themselves. And you may well be thinking, well, this is sounding like an argument in favour of affirmative action and quotas. And hell, maybe it is, but that doesn't mean it's liberal. Because every time you discriminate in favour of someone based on their race or their gender or whatever arbitrary reason about them, you are also discriminating against someone else based on those very same categories. Let's take the example of Jian Li, a freshman at Yale who had filed a complaint against Princeton with the Office of Civil Rights and the US Department of Education, charging that the university had rejected him because he was Asian American. Despite perfect SAT scores, near-perfect achievement test scores, 9 AP classes, and a class rank in the top 1% at Livingston High School in New Jersey, Lee says he was rejected by Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, the University of Pennsylvania, and MIT because of his race, despite all of his hard work. And this is not some kind of isolated case. You can make all of the arguments that you want, that these things are necessary, that they have to be done, that for some reason these poor Asian guys who have worked all their lives to get to this point, to apply to a top-class university, are being denied because minority students, other minorities, with lesser grades are being given their positions instead. That is not equality of opportunity. That is not liberal. There are many arguments against affirmative action, and I really think that Thomas Sowell, a black ex-Marxist's observations on this are really pertinent, and I I hate to play the identity politics game, but he says that preferences primarily benefit minority applicants from middle and upper class backgrounds. At the same time, because admissions are a zero-sum game, preferences hurt poor whites and even many Asians, who we already know meet the admission standards in disproportionate numbers. If preferences were truly meant to remedy disadvantage, they would be given on the basis of disadvantage and not on the basis of race, because the basis of disadvantage is an individualistic position. Each person's situation is different, so those individuals who are disadvantaged and who need the help should get it, instead of collectively deciding that black people or Mexican people just can't get into universities on their own. And given that they're not all in the same situation, that means that there are going to be black and Mexican people who received unfair advantage when they didn't need it, at the expense of someone else who did need it. But not only that, it's insulting to that individual, because people won't ever really know whether they were the result of an affirmative action policy or not. The method through which all of this is justified is something called identity politics. It's the reason why the famous civil rights activist senator on his presidential campaign trail can be interrupted and have his platform hijacked by a small group of young black students. They have done nothing to earn this platform, unlike Bernie Sanders, but they felt entitled to it entirely on the basis of their race, an arbitrary classification entirely designed to remove their individuality and place them as part of some kind of collective that apparently shares a universal experience within the United States. Even though nothing may have happened to these two young ladies as individuals, they get to claim ownership of other people's experiences based on the way they were born, which is, of course, deeply anti-individualistic. And this kind of mindset has led to something known as the progressive stack. I'll let these students explain it to you.
What I have to do here, I just want some people to be aware of what's going on, is that they do things by a consensus, which means everyone gets to be heard. And the way people speak at their general assemblies is there are facilitators that keep a stack, which means a list of people who would like to speak. In New York, they use something called a progressive stack, which means if you have your name on a list and you come from a traditionally marginalized background, race, gender, ethnicity, anything that is traditionally marginalized, you get bumped up the list. So this means we want to be able to hear what everyone has to say. Also, one of the things stressed at Occupy Wall Street is the step up, step back. This means people who have been privileged all their lives, mainly white men, white women even, people who have been privileged, need to realize that they need to step up and step back if they've already said what they had to say.
This is, of course, the diametric opposite of equality of opportunity. This is equality of outcome. This is literally deciding a person's value of input, not based on what they have to say or the merit of their arguments or whether they even have anything to say at all, but instead based on arbitrary features and factors about that person and how they relate to larger groups. The individual is irrelevant.